Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. It is Thursday, November the 6th. To talk about what the Mark Carney budget means to you, I'm pleased to welcome back Dr. Tim Sargent, an economist and the Director of Domestic Policy at the famous Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. Dr. Sargent, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nigel.
It's a great pleasure. Tim, once upon a time, you were a deputy minister. You were in the PCO, the Privy Council office. You were in finance. You're used to the salesmanship that goes with these things. So can you strip away the syrupy words and tell us what they just did here with this budget?
Happy to, Nigel. And there's a lot of words. It's 406 pages. Even I have trouble going through it, and I used to help write them, as you said. The most consequential budget in recent Canadian history was the 1995 budget, which is less than half the length of this one. So in terms of the budget itself, I mean, there's lots of graphics, lots of political message, but to strip away, I mean, you basically got to ask three questions about what the government's trying to do here. Firstly, are they focusing on the right problem? And I think for many years, certainly over the Trudeau government, they're actually not focusing on the right problems, but I think this budget does. The real problem, we have two problems in Canada. We have a short-term economic problem coming from the Trump administration and its attack on our trade. But then we have a more important long-term problem with productivity in this country, which has been lagging behind the United States for at least a decade. And underneath that is low investment. Like we simply just have not been investing as a country. And here I'm talking about the private sector. So I think the budget recognizes that. It recognizes that these two economic problems are serious, and the government needs to address them. The second question you would have is, okay, we've got the right problem. Do we understand what's causing the problem? And I would say, and I think most economists would say, that challenge of the last 10 years is government has gotten too big, immigration is too high, taxes are too high, there's too much regulation. I think the budget recognizes some of those problems. There's an attempt to cut the size of government, reducing immigration, something on taxes, do talk about regulation. So I think that they mostly understand the problem, understand what's causing the problem. But the third and most important part of it is, what are you actually going to do to address the problem? And do you have the strength, the willpower, and do you have the right ideas to address those problems? It's all very well to, have a problem, understand the causing, but the main thing is to actually go ahead and deal with the problem. And here, I think, is where the budget really comes up short. I think you have a bunch of half measures. They cut the public sector, but by nowhere near as much as it's grown over the last few years. They cut taxes, but not as much as I think that they could, and it's focused at the low end. There's cuts to corporate income tax, but perhaps not as big as they need to be. Immigration's cut, but by not as much as it should to be. So there's a bunch of half measures. There's also a fair amount of waffle about the emissions cap. Do we have an emissions cap? Don't we have an emissions cap? It's a bit like Schrodinger's cat right now. It's sort of, we don't really want to open the box and see if it's there or not. Electric vehicle mandate, is that staying or not? Well, they're going to do a review. They're going to tell us a bit more later. And then there's a few areas where I think they're clearly doubling down on the wrong policies. On housing, for instance, it's not government that's going to build the homes to solve the housing crisis. You've got to be cutting regulations, making sure that interest rates aren't too high. If you look at the direction of climate policy overall, I mean, they're still very much focused on 2050 and net zero, want to increase the industrial carbon tax to $170 at a time where a lot of our businesses are going to be struggling, throwing a lot of money at infrastructure. So, if you strip away a lot of the salesmanship, I think that they're trying to get at the problems, but a lot of these solutions are either not enough or they're going in the wrong direction.
Well, there's a number of things there that are of particular interest to our audience. Let's go back to the emissions cap. I mean, for those people not involved in the oil industry directly, that's a bit of jargon. But what it means is that the large oil companies, especially those involved in extracting oil from the oil sands, are being told that they can't emit as much carbon dioxide because of the climate change narrative, and that is a constriction on production. So, to give them their due, the oil companies have got quite creative about how to produce the same amount of oil with less carbon dioxide, even pushing the stuff underground with massive pumps and at incredibly low temperatures. So carbon sequestration. But even after you've done all that, it, there is still carbon produced. And so the issue seems to be that the government in this budget is promising that it will increase the price of carbon that be charged to the producing companies from $80 now to $170 in about 5 years' time. My question is, how does that flow out into the marketplace? Does it mean, I don't see how it can fail to mean higher prices for gasoline and other energy products. And then more generally, does this give the industry a chance to even stay afloat? Because they're producing for export. And this is going to push the price up.
Absolutely. And it's a very, very competitive market for oil, for gas, for refined gasoline. What's interesting is if you look at the budget actually, the section of the budget that talks about climate starts out by saying how good our companies are, how at actually having low emissions and how much progress that they've made. And they compare Canada to many other countries around the world that haven't made the same progress in reducing emissions in the oil and gas sector. So you could say, well, Canada's so good. Why do we need to go further? Why can't we just wait for everybody else to catch up with where we are? But the government, of course, it's intent on squeezing every last carbon dioxide emission out of the Canadian economy.
Only in the Western Canadian economy. You can still import all the oil you want from Nigeria or Kazakhstan, and this doesn't apply.
That's right. I mean, the world wants
how do they square those things?
And of course, at the same time, they want to see more investment. The whole budget is supposedly about incenting private sector investment, and oil and gas sector is a huge investor in the Canadian economy. So, unfortunately, what this is going to do, if they're serious about it, is it's just going to make further oil and gas investment in the Canadian economy uneconomic. Private sector investors have lots of places to put their money around the world, including in places that have very high emissions in their oil and gas sectors. But international investors really don't care about that. And one thing that we've seen over the last few years is that even just over the last years, they've stopped pretending to care. You've seen the whole ESG, environmental, social, and governance movement, which is designed to put pressure on companies and financial institutions to not invest in so-called dirty industries. That has really ground to a halt. So investors right now, they're being very hard-nosed, and they won't value money for that dollar, and that dollar won't come to Canada if the conditions aren't right.
Well, it seems when you were saying, it's very obvious from the big numbers that have been committed to what they describe as investment. I mean, the number of $115 billion was given out for infrastructure. Well, what's the infrastructure going to be? It doesn't seem like there's going to be much need for pipelines, but in any case, this is all government investment. It seems to me that is probably, if you wanted to build an economy, the last people you would want doing it would be the government. You would want to attract private capital. And 20 years ago, we were even 10 years ago, we were attracting it like crazy. It's gone away. So is there actually, do you think, reading between the lines as much as you can, do you think that this government actually has a comfort with being in charge of the economy, and rather than just being a keeper of the rules, actually wants to run things?
I think that's right. I mean,
you do? Because if I'm right, I'm scared.
Because they see the problem, and it's great to have smart people at the top of government. Mark Carney is very smart. I've worked with him, for him, been across the table for him. The challenge with being very smart, though, is that you think that every problem has a solution and that you need to be that solution. And the reality is, however smart you are, the real way to get investment is not for somebody at the top of government, however smart, to say, well, we need to invest here or we need to invest there. You don't have all of the information needed for that. It's not, you're not the actual person on the ground who knows what market demand is, knows what the costs are, and has that market discipline that forces you to make correct economic decisions. Governments can afford to indulge themselves and often end up investing in things that the private sector doesn't want to invest in, but for good reason, because they actually don't make any economic sense. You can see this on housing as a good example. We're going to be spending billions of dollars to build a very small number of houses, because when the government builds things, it's always a lot more expensive. The government's not very good at getting value for money for its dollar, because it's not the government's dollars, they're ultimately taxpayers' dollars. But when it's an individual, when it's a company, it's their dollars, or they're responsible to their shareholders, and they will actually make much better decisions than government.
Well, you're making it sound, and I think perhaps you intend to make it sound like a technocrat's budget. And of course, that is one of the frequent criticisms of Mr. Carney, that he is slightly less than human and therefore a technocrat. It's an unkind thing to say, but he doesn't do well on personality. So the thing is, I'm looking through this budget, and I confess I haven't gone all through 493 pages, but I look through the budget and I go out and I think, well, who is this really trying to please? What if I was a liberal? What would I look at in there and say, that is going to be good for me, and he gets my vote? What do you think what is there that you could actually go out and sell to your liberal voter base?
I mean, there's not a lot there. If you are, let's say, a Trudeau liberal, which probably means actually in your heart an NDPer, just an NDPer likes to be in government. There's not a lot there, and in many ways, they're going in the opposite direction from the Trudeau government. The cuts to the public sector, maybe not as big as some economists would like to see, but they're definitely there. The emissions caps in question, the EV policy is in question. We're seeing cuts to immigration, significant cuts. There's definitely some more spending there. As I say, there's on housing, there's on infrastructure. There's $5 billion, for instance, that's going to be spent on building hospitals. Now, I like hospitals as much as the next person, but I don't think it's the federal government's job to build hospitals. That's why we have provincial governments. But if you're a liberal, liberals tend to care less about what the federal provincial division of powers should be, and are always keen for the federal government to interfere in areas of provincial competence. So you do have some of these, nice little spending items, but it's certainly not the same as we've seen in some previous Liberal budgets.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm wondering if, in my own mind, whether I can honestly portray this as the whole thing as an extension of federal government involvement and control in the Canadian economy overall. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's right. I think they're trying to catalyze investment, as they put it, across a whole series of sectors, including areas where we should really see the provinces take the lead. Natural resources is a good example where, really they should be pulling back and allowing the provinces to manage their natural resources and decide what appropriate emissions cuts are, for instance. And that's basically what the Constitution says. It should be provinces that manage the natural resources, and provinces that decide what infrastructure they need. Now, if it crosses a provincial boundary, that means you need a pipeline, then yes, the federal government should step in. But of course, we're not actually seeing anything really in this budget about pipelines. They stay away from that particular infrastructure investment, even though they want to double exports to the rest of the world. Well, I don't see how you can do that without exporting more oil and gas, particularly over the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean.
Okay, just to be the devil's advocate for a moment, if I were a liberal flack wanting to present this in the most attractive way that I could, I'd build the argument something like this: the global markets might give this a passing grade because strong for investment, trade, and stability. We're sending a clear signal that we have ambitious capital incentives, bold infrastructure plans, pragmatic resource strategy. Did I say tragedy? It all sets the tone as the country pivots to compete both in North America and beyond. And not all debt is bad. Sometimes, if you put it to good use, then debt is the right thing to do. If I were to write that, would you grudgingly endorse it, or would you come back and say, no, 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 you clearly missed the point?
Look, I mean, there's some of that in there. The problem is they're trying to have their cake and eat it in many ways. They're trying to have, yes, we've got some corporate tax incentives, like expensing or manufacturing and processing, for instance, but we also want to spend more and increase the deficit. We also want to put money into housing and infrastructure. So which is it? Is this a making government smaller budget, or is it a making government bigger budget? At the end of the day, if we look at what's happening to spending, if we look at the deficit, which is going to stay around 2% of GDP for the foreseeable future, you see debt charges going up. Debt charges, that's the cost of the nation's credit card. It's going up 40% over the next 5 years, reaching around 70 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money.
So you're saying that our annual debt charges that the federal government will pay to the people who lend it money are going to $70 billion. What are they today?
That would be about 40 or 50 billion.
So almost, not quite half as much again, but getting that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, one of the things that as a conservative opinion writer, we tend to keep coming back to say is that government borrowing is inflationary. And certainly we've seen outright increase of the in borrowing for the next, well, actually they're not ever forecasting a balanced budget now. There used to be a time when they say, give us 3 or 4 years to amuse ourselves, and then we'll get back to a balanced budget. Well, now, I think this year's deficit is going to be $78 billion. They will borrow that. Next year is, I think I'm right, $65 billion, which they will then go to the market for. And $50 billion, another $50 billion. A couple of things about that. One is that Mr. Carney, when he was campaigning before the last election, actually said he would go out and do that. He said he would borrow nearly $250 billion. Well, now he is planning to do that. And I'm rather struck. Generally speaking, you don't campaign and go out and say you're going to get yourself into horrible debt. So did he have this in mind all along?
Well, I think he is very bought into the argument, yes, that if there's good spending and bad spending.
I see.
Good spending is investment spending, and bad spending is current spending, if you like. The question is, and I don't think economists would disagree with that, the question is where you draw that line. And the problem is government starts saying, well, investment spending good, and all kinds of things suddenly become investment, where all you're ready to do is subsidizing industries or writing checks for municipalities to build community centers or high-speed rail networks that we don't necessarily need. It's a very, very slippery slope. And the politics will always push you into wanting to spend more and more, and therefore you're just going to try and run as much as you can under that investment banner. And those governments that have tried to use this investment, this capital, but separating capital budgeting from operating and trying to deal with them separately, as happened in Alberta, of course, when Alison Redford was premier. It's happened in the UK. They've always gone into trouble, and financial markets will always look through that. Well, what financial markets care about is what you said. It's how much money does the government have to borrow? And from an economic perspective, those are resources that can't be used in the rest of the economy. So that's the government taking money away from the rest of the economy from Canadians and saying, instead of letting you spend that, we're going to take that through taxes, or we're going to borrow it in this case, and that's money that isn't available for other things. And what that can do, as you say, is it can push up demand in the economy, and that can push up prices.
Well, you say it's not that money is not available for other things, and of course you're absolutely right. When the government is borrowing money, I believe I'm correct in saying that makes it more expensive for the private sector to borrow because somebody got there first, so now they have to pay a premium to get what they need.
That's right. If you want
So
to, yep.
if that is the case, what does that mean? And here I want to really get particular about what this budget means for ordinary Canadians who probably haven't paid as much attention to the details of it as you have. We've already talked about increasing the price of carbon to the producers, which cannot fail to translate into higher energy prices for the user. And now we're talking about the government borrowing money, forcing up the interest rates as it does so. What advice would you give to that mythical ordinary Canadian about how he can prepare himself for a new round of inflation and high interest?
Well, I think we're seeing governments around the world borrowing more. That's pushing up interest rates, and that's your signal to look at how much debt you're carrying, pay down that debt, and just not be borrowing. Borrow less and save more, because governments are doing the opposite.
You know, I'd like to be as fair as I could be to any government that is working in our favor. The key to all of this heavy spending, however, is going to be effective implementation. They seem great at setting up funds and agencies to do great things. Your opinion, two opinions actually. One, do they actually have the nous to do it? And secondly, if you were grading this budget like a teacher grades the essay, where would you put it?
Well, I think the challenge for them is it's not enough to have just a couple of smart people, very smart people at the top of government. It's not even enough to bring in a couple of people from the private sector, which they've done with the Major Projects Office, with a couple of other new institutions that they've set up. That doesn't help if the rest of the government machine just doesn't work very well. And what we've seen over the last few years is that government machine atrophy and not be able to do basic things like getting passports to Canadians on time, for instance, or asking their tax questions. So the reality is you've got this machine that's creaky, it doesn't work well. And it actually, to make it work well, it takes several years of, swapping out senior managers, changing how you do things, improving performance, getting rid of poor performers. So I don't think you've got the right machine to implement this agenda at the speed that they want to implement it. And so the other challenge is, a lot of this, you need to go a lot further on getting the government out of the way so that the private sector can actually produce prosperity, because only the private sector can do that reliably. So, in terms of grading the budget, I applaud the ambition, but I'm not sure that they're doing all of the things that they need to do. So I think, and I'm not the only one, I think who would come to this conclusion, I think we're probably looking at a C. It's not a fail, but it's not the VA that the country needs at this moment.
All right. Well, there's a lot of consensus around that. So just to repeat that last bit of advice, that if you can do it, reduce your debt and brace yourself for another round of inflation because it's on its way. Dr. Sargent, thank you very much for coming on the program. Great insights as always, and we may be seeing more of you in the near future as this thing unfolds. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.